World War II was ended on May 8th, 1945, as the unconditional surrender of Germany was formally signed by Wilhelm Keitel, which was the high command of the German armed forces. Afterwards, Germany was split into two between East and West, with the Soviet Union dominating the East and the Western Allies sharing the West between the United States, Britain, and France. And that's what happened in our timeline. But what if Germany had been split differently after World War II? This is what our friend Alternative History Hub is going to be exploring in this video today. I will also be making a video on what if Althist, who made the same video in collaboration with him, I'll be exploring his opinion on it too. So this will be the first video, and then I'm not going to release it back to back. I'm not going to release What If Althist next, but maybe a week later or something like this. Or maybe I'll do it back to back. Who knows? We'll find out. So without further ado, let's look into this. What if Germany had been split differently after World War II? Remember to like, comment, subscribe. We're on the way to 1,000 subscribers. Thank you all very much for all the returning viewers, all the new viewers. Thank you for everything. Let's get into the video.
After 2 world wars, everyone was done with Germany. And even as World War II was ongoing, there were plans of what to do with Germany once the fighting had ended. Now, as we know, Germany was divided between the 4 victors, and the tensions of the Cold War eventually split it into 2 states. It makes sense why Germany was split in the way that it was.
If you want to check out a video on World War II every day by army sizes, check out mine, which looks into this map and the entire events of the World War. Top right here.
Considering the Soviets held that territory. And so we never really think of it going different. How else could anyone have imagined it being divided? Turns out a few had their own ideas on how to split the Germans, each making their own lines on a map about what a post-war Germany should look like. There were multiple plans, so I and another alternate history channel, What If Althist, decided to pick a different plan. Each of us would pick one plan and then theorize how that specific map would turn out in history. FDR had a plan to just entirely dissolve Germany, reorganizing it into smaller states. Not quite as small as in the Holy Roman Empire, but small.
So this looks like Bavaria, Brandenburg in a way, Meckpomm, or like the Hamburg region, Hessen, and Saxony. Interesting. But then I wonder what's this here. I guess this gets brought into the Netherlands or Belgium or something. All right, let's see what FDR's plan was.
What If Althist theorizes about how such a plan might pan out in his own video, so go check that out. There was also a plan by Churchill to split Germany north to south, with the south being a horrific abomination. Oh god. Guess Churchill drank a bit too much and felt sentimental about the days gone by. You know, when Austria-Hungary still existed. Yet there was one plan that, even though it hadn't been implemented, it did have real-world consequences, and it was considered a plan from the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, of all people, Henry Morgenthau. Morgenthau wanted to divide Germany alongside the North and South lines as well, but with one major difference. The industrial heartland of Germany in the West, the source of its economic and militaristic strength, would be entirely removed from its borders.
Fascinating. Wow. So this region, now known as Nordrhein-Westfalen or North Rhine-Westphalia, and also the Saarland and the Ruhrland, still to this day, a lot of production is here. A lot of economic power really comes from this region, and so to totally separate it, wow, what a interesting idea. Fascinating how he leaves the south, though, completely intact. This region of Bavaria as well. So, okay, so I guess the south would go to the communists, the north would go to the Allies. All right, let's keep
a deliberate plan to fundamentally alter German society, not only in denazification, but to remove its capability to ever be a modern nation again. What if in an alternate timeline, somehow, this plan was agreed upon? The Morgenthau Plan. It's an alternate 1945. The war is over. Yippee. I would imagine that in this timeline, the plan for what would happen to Germany is entirely unknown to the public. The Morgenthau Plan is not leaked to the press, mostly because, if it still is, it faced the same scrutiny that it did in our timeline. This is a scenario where the Western powers are much harsher to Germany and fully commit to absolute revenge. It was hard to simply...
Right, and that was one of the big problems that they had with World War I, was that the Treaty of Versailles was very harsh, albeit some of the other treaties, particularly that was put onto the Austrians, was even more harsh. I mean, Austria was stripped of nearly everything that it had. So in our timeline, that was one of the things in hindsight that the Allies didn't do was very unfairly demand reparations on Germany. Which is what they had done in World War I.
Let many aspects of German society continue on after so much destruction had occurred. There was no real urge to follow through with the Morgenthau
Why does he look
plan,
like John Marston?
for reasons I'm going to get into. And this was stemmed from fears of the plan failing so badly that it would only backfire in the face of the West, undoing all of the gains that they made during the war.
Definitely, yeah. Totally, and that was the main thing, is like if you subject the people again to the horrible conditions that happened after World War I, hyperinflation, everything like this, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Not only out of a worry that Nazism would resurface, but also that the German public would turn to the Soviets and communism in response. In such a timeline, let's imagine these considerations are just not thought about. Over the course of the next few years, the Americans, British, and French would begin the deconstruction and demolition of any factory or manufacturing plant in the region. A region that Germany relied on for not simply wartime production, but production of everyday basic goods. You know, the factories that we need for a modern society. The people who relied on these factories for jobs or production would protest these actions, of course, perhaps leading to riots and open rebellion, only to be brutally taken down by occupation forces. The Allied forces would then proceed to tell people living in this international zone, and this was the plan, by the way, I'm not making this up, that the German people would never again be allowed to have manufacturing or industry at all. Those that relied on the factories for jobs should move elsewhere instead. In effect, this plan was to remove the capability for millions of working men to provide for their families.
That's got to be the dumbest plan I've ever heard. I've never heard of this Morgenthau plan before. Wow, though. Okay, so you just want to basically make Germany into... I mean, to be fair, though, there is still some manufacturing in the south. So it's not like every piece of manufacturing is in the West here. But, wow, how would you even say it? Punitive. What punitive measures?
No factories of any kind would be allowed to exist in what was once the industrial heartland of Germany. And the thing was, this was an action that Morgenthau fully anticipated, as what he essentially planned was bringing an industrial state back into an agricultural society. As for the rest of Germany, it would be split between North and South. The idea was to differentiate between the heavily Catholic South and the Prussian Protestant North. Somehow Prussia still exists in this timeline, so you take some and you leave some. I would imagine this North German state would be smaller than originally planned, just by
which makes sense too.
How much advancement the Soviet troops made. And it's likely it may have been split into even 3 states. And such a confusing mess between the 3 wouldn't really be a concern, as Germany being a functioning state isn't in the question. Germany is no longer meant to be a state. This perpetual occupation was what turned many off of the idea of the Morgenthau Plan in the first place, and Churchill even commented that he didn't want the British tied to what was essentially a dead corpse. As what happens when you remove the industry from a society? You remove the ability for anybody to feed themselves or make a living, and you essentially created a humanitarian crisis.
And plus one that you would have to be constantly providing for the millions of people that lived in Germany. I don't think he's going to go into it, but what was his justification for this Morgenthau? I'm going to have to do more research on this. And maybe I should do a little bit of research before What If Altists video and see what plan he's looking at, so I can commentate a little better.
Yet sticking with the Morgenthau Plan, there is no room for foreign aid to the Germans. The people were now a part of an agrarian state and should use that to their advantage. However, there's an issue. Poor harvests and the lack of production of fertilizer in the post-war years resulted in food frankly not being existent. Germany, even in our own timeline, didn't have the capability to feed its own people. Yet there is no American aid in this alternate world. Instead, the plan continues on. So here's the thing. It has been estimated that if the Morgenthau Plan continued on as it was planned, an estimated 25 million people would have starved to death. 5 times as many Germans would die in the Allied occupation than in the war itself. At this point...
And you have to think, too, with the 6 million that were killed in the Holocaust, this would have killed nearly... My God, wow. Nearly 4 times as many people... Again, this is just a model, of course, but nearly 4 times as many people would have been killed to starvation as they would have from the Holocaust. And, of course, these are not moral equivalents, don't get me wrong. But, wow, 25 million deaths. And this might not even be to speak of any other famine that might have occurred in any of the surrounding regions. I mean, even Austria, right? What's happening with Austria in this timeline? I'm curious, in this plan, what their plan was for that country. I guess they would have remained, the first victim of Nazi aggression, and although they were split until, I believe, 1956, I want to say.
I mean, it's pretty clear that had the actual Morgenthau Plan gone through, and it was apparent that so many people were going to starve to death, the Allies would have backed off such a harsh plan. They weren't going to just let millions starve to death in the middle of Europe. But let's say that they did anyway. It's not like the Germans could, fight back. First off, imagine how exactly it would appear following the war, when the victorious Allied powers, in this case, the Western powers, occupied Germany and simply stand by and watch as millions die under their control. It would be an atrocity even greater than the Holodomor, actually, by many.
Yeah, true. The Holodomor, and also the Bengal famine that happened in India as well. There was as a direct, not as well. It's obviously something that is contentious in history. However, there were actions that were taken by the British government that made the famine worse in this region in India.
Many more millions. In fact, it'd mean that the Western powers would have killed just as many innocents as the Nazis in Russia or the Japanese in China. So by doing this, by committing to this, the Western powers in many ways immediately lose their validity after the war. To the German people, they were brainwashed by the Nazi regime and told that if the war was lost, German society would die.
True, and this is why, and it was even worse too in the East, just the brutal propaganda that was against Russians and Slavs, and that is why there was a big westward shift at the end of the war. There was a lot of refugees that tried to be captured, by the Allies rather than the Soviets. So you'd have to think too how the population dynamics would make that even worse. Would you have people fleeing this deindustrialized area to the south? Who would be wanting to live in this deindustrialized area? Yeah, it would just create unabridged amounts of chaos. And I wonder how how did he not think of this? I really got to look more into this plan.
Along with everyone they knew and loved. Yet, post-war, the German people instead saw the American occupation with planes flying in food when they were hungry.
Yes, the Berlin airlift is one of the most famous examples of this.
And to rebuild their society, and a removal of an ideology that only brought them pain. Now instead, in this alternate timeline, the Americans tear down the factories, internationalize a large chunk of their country, split Germany in two, and then their troops openly parade in the streets and sit by while a quarter of the population openly and slowly starves to death. So, had this plan actually continued, the victorious Allies would have committed equal atrocities to the Nazis, or at least enough atrocities to muddle the waters in the most black and white good versus evil war ever.
Yeah, okay, sure, fair enough. Yeah, so again, not the same moral equivalent. However, the outcome is still the same.
The end of World War II would not be the end of Nazism or fascism within Germany.
True.
In fact, it would only openly solidify Nazi propaganda against the Americans. For the Germans, the war would have been seen as one of self-defense against a ruthless cabal that the Nazis were talking about. And now the Americans were going to kill everyone.
See, and the other fascinating thing, too, is that if this had have happened, if the West was going to be very, very punitive of these measures and incredibly harsh, what would the Soviets have responded with? And you have to think, too, that the Soviets would have loved for the German state to have big socialist movements in the West, right? And for the whole state to flip to socialism, communism. So you got to think that, especially in the Cold War era here, you got to think that the Russians would use that to their advantage. Absolutely. And so if you have people fleeing more to the east after they've already fled to the west, you obviously give a lot of power here to the Soviet Union, particularly if they don't adopt measures as harsh as the West would in this timeline.
This video is going to get demonetized so bad. And in fact,
same with mine.
The ending of World War II for Germany would very
not that I'm monetized right now.
Much be like the end of World War I. A nation once again defeated, but the ideology continues on. There is no scenario where it's split in two and then reunited and becomes the undisputed leader of Europe. There is no EU. Any chance that it may, in a way, be integrated into the West, snuffed out after such a failed occupation. And so this is a part of a lesson. The peace after a war is often more important than any battle or conflict, especially in a war of ideologies. To win a conflict, you can't simply outproduce your enemy or beat them on the battlefield. And not only did fascism need to collapse under its own weight, and for its former supporters to see it for the
famous photograph here. This is the prisoners of a concentration camp. They're pointing out a specific guard who was allegedly the most brutal of them. And I think this guard was actually killed by the prisoners a few hours after this photo was taken, if I remember correctly. Again, might not be entirely correct on that one, but this is quite a famous photo.
Sham that it was. There also needed to be a replacement ideology to step in and fundamentally better the society afterwards. This was in many ways why the West went with the Marshall Plan instead. By rebuilding Germany and showing them how the Americans and British were not the corrupt monsters Hitler had portrayed them to be, it allowed for the transition into a democratic state to be easier, more homegrown. And one example to show the benefits of democracy was by bringing in truckloads of food to a starving population. Yes, you can argue this was to prevent the Germans from turning to the Soviets, but it was also to delegitimize the fear-mongering the fascists had brainwashed the population with for years. This was a crucial junction point for Germany, and if the worst-case scenario of World War II was the Nazis winning, the second worst-case scenario would be if people thought the Nazis, by accident, were proven correct.
Better. Yep,
and to a terrifying degree, many would begin to think Germany was better off under the Nazis because at least they had food. The democratic institutions put in place are not really supported by the people, and if they are, they're only increasingly right-wing or left. No hearts and minds are one. The German republics are seen simply as puppets. And as what happens with any puppet, once the hand is taken out, it goes limp. While this video is about World War II, this more importantly is a video about institutions and ideologies. Institutions only have credibility if people have faith in them. If the Morgenthau Plan had gone through, it would have given the Germans their first view of democracy, one as a punishment. A distinct...
Well, it wasn't their first view of democracy. You have to remember the Weimar Republic as well, albeit there was obviously issues in that republic too.
Negative in their lives. And this would cause a hatred that only undermines the very governments set up as replacements for the Nazis. If a government is only held up by foreign force, then it's simply a puppet, and it will collapse easily once the occupational force leaves. Every single time. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
Great video. Fantastic video. Next one up is going to be, well, again, I'll release it differently, but next one up is going to be What If Althist. He's going to be taking on the exact same issue. Hope you guys found that really interesting. I would predict that if this plan had gone, the people, they would have won left, right? They would have went to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would have used this for their power, and perhaps we would have seen a completely Soviet-dominated Germany. Then you can go crazy from there with the from the Althist from there. Cool. Thank you all very much for joining me. If you made it this far in the video, you're the best. Thank you very much. And I will see you guys in the next one. Hope you liked it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.